The sun has not yet broken the horizon. The Aegean Sea lies still, a mirror of obsidian glass that holds the first whispers of dawn in its depths. Along the northern coast of Crete, where the mountains meet the water in a marriage of stone and salt, something stirs beneath the waves. Here, just meters offshore, the ruins sleep. Columns that once held up painted ceilings now cradle schools of silver fish. Corridors that once echoed with footsteps now channel only currents. The water is so clear at this hour that you can see them, geometric patterns carved into submerged walls, the ghost of a staircase descending into deeper blue, the outline of what might have been a courtyard, a plaza, a place where people once gathered to watch ships arrive from Egypt and Cyprus and lands whose names we have long forgotten. The waves break gently over these stones. Each surge and retreat is a breath, the slow respiration of time itself. Who built these palaces? Who walked these halls when they stood proud above the waterline, when their frescoes blazed with reds and blues brighter than the Mediterranean sky? The archaeologists have given them a name, the Minoans, after a legendary king who may never have existed. But their true name, the word they called themselves, the sound their children learned as they pointed to their own chests and said, "We are," that word is lost. It drowned with the palaces, was buried with the dead, dissolved into the same sea that now cradles their ruins. As the sun finally breaches the horizon, light spills across the water like molten copper. For a moment, just a moment, the submerged stones seem to glow from within, as if remembering what it felt like to be warm, to be alive, to be part of something magnificent. Then the moment passes. The light normalizes. The ruins return to their patient waiting. But the questions remain, suspended in the water like sediment that refuses to settle. Who were they? What did they know? And why does their end feel less like history and more like a warning we've chosen to forget? To understand what was lost, we must first picture what once was. In the centuries around 2000 BCE, while other civilizations built walls and trained armies, the people of Crete were painting dolphins on their palace walls and engineering running water through terracotta pipes. The Minoans, though we must remember this is not their name, merely our label, built an empire not of conquest but of connection. Their ships, lean and swift, traced routes across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, in modern-day Turkey, in mainland Greece, and on distant islands where bronze was more valuable than gold. They were the intermediaries, the traders, the culture that tied the ancient world together through commerce rather than coercion. At the heart of this maritime web sat Knossos, the largest of their palace complexes. But Knossos was not alone. Across Crete, sister palaces rose at Phaistos, Melia, and Zakros, each unique, yet all speaking the same architectural language of light, air, and deliberate beauty. Their frescoes tell stories that mainstream history can barely contain. Young men leaping over charging bulls in displays of grace that seem to defy physics. Women in elaborate dresses, their bodices tight, their faces serene and confident, presiding over ceremonies we can observe but not fully understand. Gardens and lily. Dolphins and octopi rendered with such affection that you can sense the artist's joy in their creation. This was not a martial culture. No fortification walls protect Knossos. No weapon caches have been found in quantity. The Minoans seemed to believe, or perhaps they knew, that their strength lay elsewhere. In their ships, yes. In their trade goods, certainly. But also in something more ephemeral, in beauty itself, in the belief that a palace should be a work of art, that daily life could be an aesthetic experience. By 1700 BCE, Minoan influence touched every corner of the Aegean. Their art style was copied, their goods coveted, their ships respected. They were not conquerors, but in their own way, they ruled the sea as surely as any emperor ruled from a walled city. The waves were their territory, the wind their ally. and the island of Crete their eternal home. Or so they believed. Stand in the ruins of Knossos today, and you will notice what is absent before you notice what remains. There are no battlements, no murder holes, no positions from which archers could rain death upon approaching armies. The Minoans built their greatest palace with its face open to the world, as if defense were a concern belonging to lesser peoples. But what they built instead of walls was something far more complex. The palace sprawls across the landscape like an organism that grew rather than was constructed. Corridors branch and reconnect. Staircases ascend to nowhere or descend into mysteries. Storage rooms hold massive pithoi, ceramic jars tall as a man that once contained olive oil, wine, grain, and the wealth of an empire measured not in gold but in the harvests of the earth. Light wells puncture the structure, allowing sunshine to penetrate deep into the interior, illuminating rooms that in any other Bronze Age building would have been trapped in permanent twilight. The architects understood something about the human spirit, that it requires light. That beauty is not frivolous, that the way sunlight falls across a plastered wall at noon can be as important as the wall's structural integrity. And then there's the plumbing, sophisticated beyond anything that would be seen again for over 1,000 years. Terracotta pipes channeled fresh water through the palace. Drainage systems carried waste away. In the queen's quarters, or at least in what archaeologists have designated as such, there stands what appears to be the world's first flush toilet, a testament to engineering ambition that puts the Bronze Age in a startling new light. The palace was not merely a seat of power. It was a statement, a declaration that civilization could be measured in drainage pipes and frescoes in the width of a corridor designed to allow two people to pass while carrying amphorae, in the choice to build wide rather than tall, open rather than fortified. Walking through Knossos is like walking through a philosophy made stone. Every choice the builders made seems to argue for a particular way of being in the world, confident, open, unafraid. They built as if the future were guaranteed, as if earthquakes were merely inconveniences, as if the sea that brought them wealth could never bring them sorrow. The labyrinth that later Greek myths would describe as the prison of the Minotaur was perhaps never a prison at all. It was a palace that refused to be simple, a structure that celebrated complexity, that made mystery architectural. In its corridors, the Minoans walked with the assurance of people who believed they had solved the riddle of civilization itself. They were wrong, of course, but gods, what a beautiful wrongness it was. There is a particular sadness in silence, especially when that silence belongs to an entire people. We call them Minoans because Sir Arthur Evans, excavating Knossos in the early 20th century, needed a name and chose that of the legendary King Minos from Greek mythology. But the people who painted dolphins on plaster walls, who engineered sophisticated drainage systems, who sailed to Egypt and back with holds full of precious goods, they never called themselves Minoans. Their true name exists somewhere in the undeciphered texts of Linear A, the script they used to record their language, their prayers, their administrative records. Thousands of tablets survive, baked hard by the fires that consumed the palaces. We can see their writing, the careful marks pressed into wet clay, but we cannot hear their voices. The phonetic values remain locked, the grammar mysterious, the meaning silent. Imagine it, an entire civilization that cannot speak its own name to us, all their poetry lost, their prayers incomprehensible, the songs they sang to their children reduced to arrangements of symbols that might as well be decorative patterns for all the meaning we can extract from them. This is not merely an academic loss. When a people cannot tell us what they called themselves, what they believed, how they understood their own existence, we are forced to interpret them through the lens of others. The later Greeks, who inherited Minoan ruins and wove them into myths of mazes and monsters. The Egyptians, who traded with them but left only fragmentary references. The archaeologists, who excavate with care but must speculate about meaning. The Minoans exist in our understanding as a kind of beautiful phantom, visible, studied, analyzed, but ultimately voiceless. We can measure their buildings, catalog their art, trace their trade routes, but we cannot know how they laughed, what jokes they told, what fears they whispered in the darkness when the earth began to tremble. There is something profound in this absence. It reminds us that history is written by survivors, by those who come after, by people who impose their own frameworks of understanding on the silent remains of the past. The Minoans cannot correct our misconceptions. They cannot tell us we've misunderstood the significance of the bull, the meaning of the double axe, the identity of the snake goddess. They are present only in what they left behind, stones and bones and painted walls. And in those things, they remain magnificent. But their voices, the actual sound of the Minoan language, the cadence of their poetry, the words they used for love and fear and hope, those are lost in a silence deeper than any grave. What does it mean for a civilization to be reduced to evidence? To exist only as artifacts, never as testimony? The Minoans pose this question every time we stand before their ruins, and they offer no answer, because the answer too has been lost, dissolved into time like footprints into sand. In a corner of what archaeologists call the House of the Frescoes at Knossos, someone made a curious discovery. A blue dolphin, leaping across a plastered wall with all the joy and grace that Minoan artists could conjure, existed in 2 times at once. The fresco was clearly ancient, even when it was installed in this structure. Chemical analysis of the plaster, comparative study of the artistic style, and the physical evidence of careful removal and reinstallation all tell the same story. This dolphin swam first on another wall, in another building, possibly centuries before it came to rest in this location. Someone at some point in Minoan history decided that this particular piece of art was worth preserving, not merely leaving in place, but actively saving, cutting carefully from its original context, transporting, and installing anew. This is not the behavior of a culture that saw art as disposable decoration. This is the behavior of a culture that understood art as heritage, as something worth carrying forward through time. But why this dolphin? What made it special enough to warrant such careful treatment? Was it the work of a particularly beloved artist? Did it commemorate an event that later generations wanted to remember? Or was there something in the dolphin itself, the way its body curved through painted waves, the expression the artist somehow captured in a creature with no face capable of expression, that spoke to something deep in the Minoan spirit? We cannot know. What we can know is that preservation is an act of love. To carefully remove a fresco without destroying it, to transport it, to reinstall it in a new location, requires both skill and devotion. It requires belief that the past matters, that beauty from another time deserves protection, that some things should not be allowed to fade even as everything else changes. The dolphin swims still on its plaster sea, moved by hands we cannot name, for reasons we cannot fully understand. It survived the person who painted it, survived the building that first housed it, survived even the civilization that created it. And now it exists in our time, a testament to the Minoan belief that some beauty transcends the moment of its making. Perhaps that's answer enough. The tablets are small, palm-sized, the clay they're pressed into still bearing the marks of the fingers that held them. On their surfaces, neat rows of symbols march in careful lines, pictographic signs representing objects, syllabic signs representing sounds, numerical notations recording quantities. This is Linear A, the script of the Minoans, and despite decades of intensive study, it remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing mysteries. We can identify what the symbols represent on a basic level. This sign is a double axe. This one, a woman. This, a tree. This, perhaps a ship. But knowing what a symbol depicts is not the same as knowing what it means, or, crucially, how it sounded when spoken aloud. The Minoan language belongs to no known linguistic family. It connects to nothing that came before or after with enough certainty to serve as a key. Linear A appears to be primarily an administrative script. The tablets record inventories, transactions, religious offerings. There are tablets listing quantities of grain, of olive oil, of livestock. Some appear to be tax records. Others might be religious dedications, offerings made to deities whose names we can see written but cannot pronounce, whose nature we can guess at but never fully know. The script is clearly the ancestor of Linear B, the writing system used by the later Mycenaean Greeks who succeeded the Minoans. Linear B has been deciphered. It's an early form of Greek, adapted to use a writing system originally designed for a completely different language. By comparing Linear A and Linear B, scholars have been able to extract some phonetic values to make educated guesses about how certain signs might have sounded. But educated guesses are not translation. Knowing that a sign might represent the syllable te doesn't help if you don't know what te meant in the lost Minoan tongue. The tablets remain partially transparent, like looking through frosted glass. You can see shapes, make out general outlines, but the details remain frustratingly obscured. Some scholars believe Linear A encodes a language related to Luwian, spoken in ancient Anatolia. Others see possible connections to Etruscan, to Proto-Indo-European, even to Semitic languages from the Near East. Each theory has its proponents and its evidence, and each ultimately stumbles against the same wall. There isn't enough material, and what exists is too specialized in its content to provide the key that would unlock the entire language. Meanwhile, the tablets continue to emerge from excavations. Each one is cataloged, studied, added to the corpus of texts we can see but not read. They're like messages from a people reaching across 4,000 years, their hands touching ours through the clay, their words present but incomprehensible. In the museums where they're stored, the Linear A tablets sit in climate-controlled cases, fragments of an ongoing conversation to which we have access but no comprehension. The Minoans are trying to tell us something. We simply don't know what it is. And perhaps, in the end, that mystery is fitting. A civilization that built labyrinths has left us with the ultimate labyrinth. A language that exists without meaning, words that cannot speak. Crete sits at the confluence of tectonic ambition, where the African plate slides beneath the Aegean, grinding, pressing, building pressure that must eventually release. The Minoans built their palaces in paradise, but paradise was constructed on a foundation that remembered how to move. The first great earthquake likely came without warning, as they always do. Perhaps it was midday, the palace at Knossos alive with activity, scribes bent over their tablets, workers rolling amphorae down corridors, priestesses preparing for evening ceremonies. Then the first tremor, subtle enough to make people pause, look around, wonder if they'd imagined it. Then the real shaking began. The archaeological record preserves the violence in silent testimony. Walls cracked and shifted. Storage jars toppled, their contents flooding across floors. Ceilings collapsed, burying rooms in rubble. The carefully engineered light wells became channels for falling debris. Those sophisticated drainage systems cracked and broke, releasing floods into the lower levels. But here's what's remarkable. They rebuilt. Every time the earth betrayed them, the Minoans returned to their palaces and raised them again. Sometimes they rebuilt on slightly different plans, learning from the failures of previous designs. They developed architectural techniques to resist seismic shaking, flexible joints, strategic buttressing, building plans that distributed stress rather than concentrating it. The earthquakes shaped not just their architecture, but their mythology. In later Greek myths, inherited and transformed from Minoan sources, the earthshaker Poseidon rules with a trident, commanding waves and tremors with equal authority. Could this god have originated in Minoan attempts to understand why their island periodically tried to tear itself apart? Evidence of major seismic events appears in the archaeological record around 1700 BCE, and again around 1600 BCE each time the palaces fell. Each time, the Minoans rebuilt them, often more elaborately than before, as if defying the earth's violence with beauty, answering destruction with deliberate grace. There's something almost tragic in this pattern. A civilization that built without walls, that seemed to believe in openness and art as fundamental values, found itself repeatedly at war with the ground beneath its feet. And yet they refused to abandon their island, refused to build elsewhere, refused to give up on Crete, even as Crete periodically gave up on them. Living with earthquakes must have shaped the Minoan psychology in ways we can barely imagine. The knowledge that at any moment, everything solid might become liquid, that the ground itself could not be trusted. This must have influenced their religion, their philosophy, their art. Perhaps it explains the fluidity of their frescoes, the way Minoan art seems to celebrate motion, change, transformation. The earth trembles beneath Crete still, continuing a conversation with the island that began long before the Minoans arrived and will continue long after all memory of them has dissolved. But for those few centuries, the Minoans answered back, not with weapons or walls, but with palaces that grew more beautiful with each rebuilding, as if beauty itself were in us. Argument against chaos, an insistence that grace could prevail even in a world that periodically shook itself to pieces. They were wrong, ultimately, but watching them rebuild again and again, you can help but admire their refusal to learn what the earth kept trying to teach them. 70 miles north of Crete, the island of Thera rose from the Aegean like a mountain of stone, its volcanic peak standing guard over some of the richest trade routes in the ancient world. Minoan colonies thrived on Thera, their settlements built with the same architectural grace as the palaces of Crete in the town now called Akrotiri. Multi-story buildings housed comfortable families, their walls painted with spring flowers and swift ships. Then, sometime around 1600 BCE, the exact date remains debated, the mountain decided it had held its breath long enough. The eruption of Thera was not merely volcanic. It was apocalyptic. The explosion registered what modern volcanologists estimate as a 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, making it one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. The sound would have been heard across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The ash plume reached into the stratosphere, where it spread across the northern hemisphere, dimming sunlight, cooling temperatures, disrupting growing seasons from Egypt to China. But for Crete, the worst came not from the sky, but from the sea. The eruption generated tsunamis that radiated outward from Thera in concentric rings of devastation. Wave heights would have reached tens of meters by the time they struck Crete's northern coast. Imagine standing on a Minoan quay, watching your ships at anchor when the sea suddenly withdraws, boats settling onto mudfish flopping in exposed seabed, then seeing the horizon rise a wall of water higher than any palace, rushing toward you faster than any human could run. The archaeological evidence is written in ash and absence. A layer of Theran ash, chemically distinct and identifiable, appears in excavations across the eastern Mediterranean. In Crete, this ash layer often sits directly above evidence of tsunami impact, building collapses oriented inland, marine debris scattered far from shore, sudden burial of coastal settlements. The mainstream historical account points to this moment as the beginning of Minoan decline. The eruption destroyed Thera entirely, obliterating a major Minoan colony. The tsunamis devastated Crete's northern harbors, destroying the fleet that was the empire's lifeblood. The ashfall would have contaminated water supplies, buried agricultural land, made the air unbreathable for days or weeks. But here's where the story becomes complex. Crete survived. The palaces were damaged, but not destroyed. Knossos, set back from the coast and partially protected by hills, endured. The Minoans rebuilt once more, as they had after previous earthquakes. For decades after the eruption, Minoan culture continued, adapted, persisted. Yet something had changed. The eruption had not killed the Minoans, but it had wounded them in ways that went beyond physical destruction. Their trade network, built on the confidence of sailors who knew every current and island, suddenly faced an altered geography. Thera was gone, replaced by a flooded caldera. Routes that had been memorized for generations no longer worked. Ships that had survived the tsunami needed repair, and the resources to repair them were scarce. The fire from the sea had not ended the Minoan civilization, but it had set in motion a slow cascade of failures that would, over the following centuries, bring down what earthquakes and time had been unable to destroy. Sometimes the end of a world comes not as sudden catastrophe, but as a wound that never quite heals, bleeding slowly until everything built on that foundation finally collapses. The waves from Thera are still visible in the geological record, frozen in layers of sediment like memories of violence. The Minoans who survived must have stood on their damaged quays, looking north toward where Thera had been, and understood that they were watching their world change in ways they could not control and did not fully understand. The sea that had brought them wealth had brought them something else entirely, and the fire was only beginning. In the archaeological record, there are years that speak and years that are silent. After the Thera eruption, Crete enters a period that whispers where it once shouted, that hints where it once declared. The decades immediately following the disaster show signs of continued habitation, of rebuilding, of cultural persistence. But something has changed in the quality of what the Minoans leave behind. The art becomes less ambitious, the trade goods less diverse. The palaces are maintained, but not expanded. It's as if the civilization has turned inward, conserving energy, waiting for a renewal that never quite arrives. Historians call this the late Minoan period, but perhaps it should be called the long diminishment. Not a sudden fall, but a gradual fading like a fresco, exposed to too much sunlight, the colors leaching away so slowly that you don't notice until one day you realize you can barely make out what was once brilliantly clear. The linear A tablets from this period are fewer, their contents more mundane. The art that adorned palace walls becomes repetitive, as if the artists are copying older styles rather than innovating new ones. The far-flung trade connections begin to contract, like a body pulling blood away from its extremities to protect its core. What happened during these lost years? Why does a civilization that survived the eruption, that rebuilt after the tsunamis, nevertheless slide into a twilight from which it would never fully emerge? Some scholars point to climate data. The Thera eruption may have disrupted weather patterns across the Mediterranean for years or even decades. Cooler temperatures, altered rainfall, failed harvests, these would stress any agricultural society. The Minoans, dependent on olive oil and wine production, would have been particularly vulnerable. Others suggest that the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. A culture that believed in its own permanence, that built as if the future were guaranteed, suddenly confronted the fragility of everything it had assumed was solid. The trauma might have been cultural, a collective loss of confidence that expressed itself in less ambitious art, more conservative building, a retreat from the bold maritime adventures that had once defined them. Or perhaps the answer is simpler and more tragic. They were simply exhausted. Centuries of rebuilding after earthquakes, the massive effort required to recover from the Thera disaster, the constant struggle against a geology that refused to stay stable. Perhaps the Minoans simply ran out of the energy required to maintain their civilization at its previous height. The lost years resist easy explanation. They exist in our understanding as a blur, a transition period where something vital drains away, but we cannot quite see what it is or where it goes. The Minoans are still there, still living in their palaces, still writing their undecipherable tablets, still painting their walls with familiar motifs. But the light has changed. The shadows have grown longer. And in the silence of the archaeological record, you can sense something else approaching. Not another natural disaster, but something more permanent, more final. The lost years are not the end of the Minoan story, but they are the chapter where the ending becomes inevitable, where the trajectory shifts from growth to decline, from confidence to doubt. In the ruins today, you can sometimes feel it, the sense that the people who walked these corridors in the late period knew, on some level, that they were tending something dying, maintaining something that could not be saved, speaking a language that was already beginning to be forgotten, even as they spoke it. The lost years are lost, not because we lack evidence, but because the evidence speaks of loss itself, of a civilization trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through its fingers like water, like time, like the ash that fell from Thera and still falls. In a sense, through every generation that tries to understand what the Minoans were and why they could not remain. In the dialogues of Plato, written 1,000 years after the Minoans faded from history, there appears a story told as ancient wisdom, the tale of Atlantis, a mighty island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a civilization of remarkable sophistication that in a single day and night sank beneath the waves, punished by the gods for its hubris. For centuries, Atlantis was dismissed as pure fiction, a philosophical thought experiment about the dangers of imperial overreach. But as archaeologists excavated Crete and Thera, as the story of the Minoan civilization emerged from beneath the earth, some began to wonder, what if Plato's Atlantis was not invention, but memory, distorted by a millennium of retelling relocated by later Greeks who no longer knew the geography, but remembered the essence? Consider the parallels. Plato describes Atlantis as a maritime power dominating trade across a vast area. The Minoans controlled trade routes spanning the entire eastern Mediterranean. Atlantis possessed advanced architecture with elaborate palaces and sophisticated water management. The palace at Knossos featured running water and drainage centuries ahead of its time. The Atlanteans worshipped bulls and held ceremonies involving them. The Minoans painted bulls on every available surface and clearly incorporated them into religious rites. And then there's the destruction. Plato says Atlantis was destroyed by catastrophic earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the sea in a single catastrophic event. Thera exploded, generating tsunamis that devastated Crete's harbors. While Crete itself didn't sink, portions of coastal settlements did disappear beneath the waves, and Thera, a major Minoan colony, literally vanished into the caldera its eruption created. The theory has its skeptics, naturally. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean, not in the Mediterranean. His timeline, counting back from the age of Solon, puts Atlantis approximately 9,000 years before his own time, far too early for the Minoans. The dimensions he provides don't match Crete or Thera, but what if these discrepancies are the natural result of a story transmitted orally for 1,000 years, filtered through Egyptian sources, translated into Greek, reshaped by each generation of storytellers? What if the core truth, a sophisticated maritime civilization destroyed by geological catastrophe, survived even as the details shifted, mutated, grew to mythological proportions? There's something compelling about the idea that Atlantis is not lost because it never existed, but because it existed too well, burned too bright, built too beautifully, and then fell so completely that later generations, hearing stories of its grandeur, couldn't believe such a place could have been real and located in the familiar Mediterranean. So the stories moved it westward, into the mythological ocean beyond the known world, where marvels were allowed to exist. If the Minoans are Atlantis, or at least, if they inspired the myth, then Atlantis has been found. It lies in the ruins of Knossos, in the frescoes of Akrotiri, in the ash layer that marks the moment when fire from the sea changed everything. The lost civilization is lost no longer, merely renamed, misplaced in time and space by the limitations of memory. But perhaps it doesn't matter whether the Minoans were Atlantis. Perhaps what matters is that both stories, The myth and the history speak to the same deep human anxiety, that everything we build, no matter how sophisticated, how beautiful, how permanent it seems, rests on foundations we do not control and cannot trust. That the earth and sea are only temporarily patient with our ambitions. That hubris is not punished by gods, but by geology. And the punishment comes not as moral judgment, but as simple amoral physics. The Minoans built their palaces without walls, believing perhaps that nothing could threaten them. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, grew arrogant in its power, forgetting that power itself is temporary. Both learned the same lesson, written in ash and tsunami deposits and collapsed buildings. Everything ends. Everything sinks. And the sea keeps secrets better than any library ever could. In the Nile Delta, in sediment layers dating to approximately 1600 BCE, archaeologists found something that didn't belong. Microscopic particles of volcanic ash, chemically distinct, traceable through spectrographic analysis to a single source, the eruption of Thera over 500 miles to the north. Think about what this means. The explosion was powerful enough to deposit measurable ash, not just on nearby islands, but across the sea, over the horizon, into the agricultural heartland of Egypt. The people of ancient Egypt, going about their lives along the Nile, must have experienced days of dimmed sunlight, ash falling like gray, snow the sky turning strange colors as particles suspended in the atmosphere scattered light in unfamiliar ways. Egyptian texts from this period don't explicitly describe the eruption. Why would they, when they had no context to understand what had happened? But there are references to darkness, to unusual weather, to years of poor harvests. The tempest stele, erected during the reign of Amos I, describes violent storms and darkness, so complete that lamps were needed at midday. While the stele's events are sometimes attributed to local phenomena, the timing aligns suspiciously well with the Thera eruption. The ash particles in the Nile Delta are minute, requiring microscopes to identify and sophisticated chemical analysis to source. But they represent an unshakable physical connection between the fall of a Minoan colony and changes in Egyptian climate hundreds of miles away. They prove that the Thera eruption was not a local disaster, but a regional catastrophe, affecting civilizations that may have had no understanding of what had occurred or why their world had suddenly changed. Consider the Minoan sailors who had brought Egyptian pharaohs luxury goods, purple dye, sophisticated pottery, olive oil. After the eruption, those trade contacts would have faltered, then failed. The Egyptians must have wondered what happened to their trading partners, why the ships from Crete came less frequently, why the goods they'd grown accustomed to were suddenly unavailable or vastly more expensive. Did Egyptian merchants travel north to investigate? Did they find Minoan ports in ruins, survivors struggling to rebuild? A civilization wounded in ways that went far beyond the physical damage? The historical record, frustratingly, is silent on this point. But the ash particles speak anyway, connecting two civilizations through disaster, linking the fall of Thera to crop failures in Egypt in a chain of causation that no one at the time could have fully understood. Today, those ash particles exist primarily in scientific papers, their significance understood only by specialists. But they represent something profound, evidence that even in the Bronze Age, the world was connected, that disaster in one region rippled outward, affecting peoples and places that seemed distant and separate. The Thera eruption reached Egypt not with tsunamis, but with ash and altered climate. It's a quieter form of devastation, but devastation nonetheless. And somewhere in the Nile Delta, buried in sediment layers that mark a moment of historical rupture, the evidence waits for anyone careful enough to look, patient enough to sift through dirt, searching for particles of glass that once were mountain, that once were home to people who painted dolphins and believed their world was permanent. The ash tells a story without words. Sometimes that's the most reliable kind of testimony. In the museums where Minoan artifacts rest behind glass, She stands with her arms outstretched, her bodice tight across her breasts, her bare arms holding snakes that coil around her wrists and rise toward her face with no apparent threat. Her eyes are wide, her expression serene, her dress elaborate with layers and patterns that must have taken incredible skill to create. This is the snake goddess, one of the most iconic images of Minoan religion, and she watches museum visitors with the same calm intensity she's maintained for nearly 4,000 years. Who was she? A priestess? A deity? A mortal woman dressed as a goddess for a ceremony? The figurines' multiple versions have been found offer no explanation beyond their existence. They simply present femininity and power combined with snakes, those ancient symbols of transformation, of death and rebirth, of the Earth's dangerous generative force. Minoan religion remains largely mysterious, written in rituals we can observe through art but cannot fully decode. What seems clear is that female figures dominated their spiritual landscape. The frescoes show processions led by women, ceremonies presided over by priestesses, shrines tended by female attendants. If the Minoans worshipped male gods, and they likely did, those gods left far fewer traces in the archaeological record. The bull appears constantly in Minoan art and was clearly sacred, but it's frequently shown being leaped over by young people, suggesting ritualized interaction rather than simple worship. Mountain peaks held special significance. Numerous peak sanctuaries have been found, places where offerings were left, where perhaps the boundary between earth and sky, human and divine, felt thinner. Some scholars have interpreted Minoan religion as evidence of a matriarchal or at least matrilineal society, one where women held spiritual authority that translated into social power. Others caution against reading too much into artistic choices, noting that we cannot know whether the prominence of female figures in religious contexts reflected actual social structures or simply divided religious and political authority along gender lines. But there's something undeniably different about Minoan religious imagery compared to their contemporaries. In Egypt, pharaohs dominated religious art. In Mesopotamia, warrior kings stood before the gods. In Mycenaean Greece, which would eventually succeed the Minoans, military aristocracies centered on male champions. The Minoans, by contrast, left us with snake goddesses and priestesses, with ceremonies centered on nature's fertility, with a spiritual worldview that seemed to find divinity in transformation rather than dominion. Could this reflect an older worldview, one that predated the patriarchal warrior cultures that dominated the Bronze Age? Some archaeologists have suggested that Minoan culture preserved elements of Neolithic goddess worship, a kind of religious system that left us the enigmatic goddess figurines of old Europe, the vast temple complexes of Malta, the mother goddess imagery that appears across prehistoric Europe and the Near East. If so, the Minoans might have been cultural conservators, maintaining a spiritual tradition that most of the ancient world had already abandoned in favor of pantheons led by storm gods and sky fathers. Their religious art would then represent not innovation but preservation, a window into a worldview that most cultures had already closed. The snake goddess watches, holding her serpents with the confidence of someone who has no fear of what they represent. Behind glass, in climate-controlled museum cases, she endures, the last priestess of a religion we can see but not practice, represent but not revive, admire but never fully comprehend. Her eyes remain wide and her arms remain raised, and the snakes coil eternally around her wrists. And we stand before her, 4,000 years of silence between us, trying to understand what she meant to the people who shaped her, what power she represented, what promises she made. She offers no answers, but in her silence, she suggests questions that archaeology alone cannot address. What happens to the gods when their worshippers disappear? Where does the sacred go when no one remembers how to approach it? And can power be measured in something other than conquest? The Minoans seem to have thought so. The goddess watches as if to remind us that they once knew something the rest of the ancient world had forgotten. We simply don't know what it was. Night falls over Knossos, and the palace transforms. Shadows pool in corridors that were bright at midday. The frescoes fade into darkness, their colors muted, their dolphins and lily reduced to suggestions. But if you know where to look, if you understand what the Minoans understood about the sky, the palace reveals another layer of meaning. Recent archaeoastronomical studies have identified something remarkable. Certain windows, doorways, and sightlines in Minoan palaces align with astronomical events. At the spring equinox, sunlight enters specific chambers at precise angles, illuminating particular frescoes or altar spaces. The summer solstice sunrise, viewed from certain courtyards, frames itself between mountains in ways that seem too deliberate to be accidental. The bull, that omnipresent symbol of Minoan culture, may have had celestial significance beyond its earthly power. Some scholars have noted that during the Minoan period, the spring equinox occurred with the sun in Taurus, a constellation of the bull. This was the moment when the agricultural year began in earnest, when the earth renewed itself, when winter's grip finally released the Mediterranean to spring's warmth. Could the bull-leaping ceremonies, those breathtaking displays of human grace and courage depicted in frescoes, have been timed to celestial events? Were the young athletes vaulting over sacred bulls in synchrony with the sun's movement through the zodiac, enacting earthly rituals that mirrored cosmic patterns? The Minoans left no written astronomy texts, or if they did, they're locked in the undeciphered linear A script. But the evidence is built into their architecture. Peak sanctuaries, those high places where Minoans left offerings, often provide clear views of the horizon, perfect for tracking the sun's rising and setting points throughout the year. Some of these sanctuaries contain what appear to be marker stones, alignments that would have helped Bronze Age observers predict solstices and equinoxes. This kind of astronomical observation wasn't unique to the Minoans. Stonehenge in Britain, the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, all show that Bronze Age peoples paid careful attention to celestial patterns. But the Minoan approach seems characteristically different. Where Stonehenge is monumental, and the pyramids are testaments to engineering ambition, Minoan astronomical architecture is integrated, subtle, woven into the fabric of daily life rather than set apart as something separate. The palace wasn't just a residence or an administrative center. It was, among its many functions, an instrument for reading the sky, for keeping time not with water clocks or sundials, but with the movement of the building itself through the year. Stand in the right courtyard on the right day, and the palace would tell you the season, would confirm that the world was proceeding as it should, that the cosmic order remained intact. This suggests a worldview where earthly and celestial realms were not separate, but intimately connected. The bull in the sky and the bull in the ceremonial arena were aspects of the same sacred force. A goddess with her snakes stood on earth, but reached toward the stars. The palace, with its light wells and aligned corridors, was both a practical structure and a cosmological diagram, a place where humans could live while remaining conscious of their position in a larger, ordered universe. Tonight, the stars wheel overhead in patterns the Minoans knew by heart. Taurus rises in its season. The Pleiades, those seven sisters so important to Mediterranean sailors and farmers, glitter like scattered diamonds. The palace at Knossos no longer functions as it once did. Its roof is gone, its corridors are empty, its sightlines are interrupted by modern reconstruction. But the stars remain, following the same paths they followed when Minoan astronomers tracked them. When Minoan priestesses timed ceremonies to their appearance, when the bull in the heavens and the bull in the arena were understood as parts of a single sacred whole. The Minoans built their palaces to last centuries. They didn't know, couldn't have known, that they were also building calendars that would outlast their civilization. Astronomical instruments that would continue to mark the seasons long after the last Minoan astronomer had turned to dust. The light still falls at the equinox, illuminating chambers where no one waits to witness it. The stars still align with doorways that lead nowhere, but the patterns persist. And in those patterns, something of the Minoan understanding endures. The belief that everything connects, that the cosmos and the palace and the bull, and the priestess, and the spring planting and the harvest and the sea are all part of one great synchronized dance stirring through time like the constellations wheel through their eternal courses. The dance continues, even though the dancers are long gone. There is something that appears in Egyptian art with regularity, in Mesopotamian friezes, and the later Greek pottery that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean aesthetic. Scenes of battle, warriors striking down enemies, soldiers in formation, kings standing over the conquered. The ancient world, as recorded in its art, was violent, and that violence was deemed worthy of representation, of celebration, of permanent record. The Minoans painted dolphins. This is not to say that Minoan society was entirely peaceful. No human society ever has been. Weapons appear in Minoan contexts, though in smaller quantities than in contemporary cultures. Evidence of interpersonal violence exists in the skeletal record, as it does in every population. The Minoans were human, with all that implies, but their art tells a different story than their contemporaries chose to tell. The frescoes that covered palace walls showed gardens and games, religious ceremonies and marine life, acrobats and lily and crocus flowers gathering saffron. Where later Mycenaean art would depict warriors and boar hunts, Minoan artists painted young women in procession, their dresses elaborate, their bearing confident. There is a famous fresco fragment showing what has been called the Parisienne, a young woman with elaborate curled hair, dark eyes, rouged lips, an expression that seems simultaneously dignified and playful. She's not a warrior or a conquering queen. She's simply herself, rendered with such care and affection that even across 4,000 years, her personality seems to emerge from the plaster. This consistent choice, to depict grace rather than violence, nature rather than conquest, beauty rather than power, suggests a culture with fundamentally different values than its neighbors. Or perhaps it suggests a culture that valued different kinds of power: the power of art to transform spaces, the power of beauty to create cultural cohesion, the power of shared aesthetic experience to bind a society together. How does such a culture survive in a violent world? The answer, ultimately, is that it doesn't, not indefinitely. The Minoans' lack of military focus, their open palaces without fortifications, their art that celebrates life rather than dominance, all of this made them vulnerable when harder, more martial cultures arrived. But there's a profound dignity in the choice they made. They knew the world they lived in. They traded with Egypt and the Near East. They couldn't have been ignorant of how other cultures organized themselves. And yet they chose differently. They built palaces as artworks. They trained their young people not primarily as soldiers, but as athletes, dancers, bull leapers. They decorated their walls with nature's beauty rather than martial triumph. Standing in the ruins today, walking through the same corridors where those frescoes once blazed with color, the silence is overwhelming. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of choice, the conscious decision to speak of some things and not others, to record what seemed worthy of remembrance and let the rest fade unrecorded. What the Minoans chose to remember was beauty. What they chose to celebrate was grace. What they painted on their walls, what they pressed into their seal stones, what they shaped in gold and faience and ivory, was a vision of life as something more than survival, more than conquest, more than the accumulation of power over others. They were wrong about how to survive in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The cultures that celebrated warriors and built walls endured longer, or at least their names survived in clearer form. But the Minoans were right about something else, something harder to quantify, but perhaps more important, that how we choose to represent ourselves matters. That art is not frivolous, but foundational. That a civilization can be measured not by whom it conquered, but by what it chose to paint on its palace walls when it had the freedom to paint anything at all. The dolphins still swim across the plaster, frozen mid-leap in eternal joy. The priestesses still press us toward shrines we cannot enter. The gardens still bloom in pigment and imagination. And the warriors, the battles, the scenes of dominance that filled the art of surrounding cultures, these are absent, present only in their absence, a silence that speaks as eloquently as any declaration of power ever could. The Minoans built an empire of beauty. It couldn't last. But gods, while it existed, it must have been something magnificent to witness. Sometime around 1450 BCE, the tablets change. The shift is subtle at first, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. The clay tablets found in the last phase of the palace at Knossos are still impressed with linear script, still recording administrative details in neat rows. But the language has changed. This is Linear B, and unlike its predecessor Linear A, this script has been deciphered. In 1952, architect and amateur linguist Michael Ventris demonstrated that Linear B encodes an early form of Greek. The tablets that emerge from the final phase of Minoan palaces are written in the language of the Mycenaeans, the warrior culture from mainland Greece that would eventually dominate the Aegean. The mainstream historical interpretation is straightforward. The Mycenaeans conquered Crete, weakened by earthquakes and the Thera eruption. Vulnerable after decades of decline, the Minoan palaces fell to an invasion from the north. The conquerors took over the administrative apparatus, adapted the Minoan writing system to their own language, and began the process of Hellenization that would eventually transform Crete from a Minoan island into a Greek one. Evidence supports this interpretation. Mycenaean pottery styles appear in late Minoan contexts. Weapons typical of mainland Greek warriors turn up in Cretan burials. The architecture begins to shift, incorporating elements more characteristic of Mycenaean palatial culture: throne rooms, defensive considerations, a martial aesthetic that contrasts sharply with earlier Minoan openness. But conquest is rarely a simple story of replacement. Cultures blend, adapt, transform each other, even in contexts of domination. The Mycenaeans who took over Knossos didn't simply erase Minoan culture. They absorbed aspects of it, were changed by it, even as they changed it. The Linear B tablets record offerings to deities, some Greek, like Poseidon, but others whose names don't appear in later Greek mythology, names that might be Minoan gods, transliterated into Greek script. The palace at Knossos continued to function in recognizably Minoan ways, even under Mycenaean administration. The frescoes continued, though with new themes emerging alongside traditional motifs. This is the nature of cultural transition: messy, incomplete, contradictory. The Minoans didn't vanish overnight. They were absorbed, transformed, their culture mixing with the Mycenaean to create something that was neither purely Minoan nor purely Greek, but some hybrid of both. In the villages and farmlands away from the palaces, the process would have been even more gradual. Peasants continued farming the same fields, tending the same olive groves, speaking their own language, even as the administrative language above them changed. Cultural identity in the ancient world was less rigid than modern nationalism assumes. People adapted, survived, maintained what they could of old ways, while incorporating new ones. But the arrival of the strangers marks a boundary nevertheless. After this point, Crete is no longer a Minoan island. The palaces continue for a while under Mycenaean administration, but the creative spirit that built them, the aesthetic sensibility that painted dolphins and priestesses, the cultural confidence that built without walls, this begins to fade. The strangers brought their own gods, their own language, their own way of organizing the world. They brought weapons and warrior culture, defensive walls and martial values. They brought the beginning of what would become classical Greek civilization, with all its glory and achievement. But in coming, they also brought an ending. The Minoan world, unique, remarkable, irreplaceable, began its final transformation into something else, something that would eventually be remembered only in fragments and myths in ruins that later Greeks would excavate without realizing whose grandeur they were uncovering. The tablets in Linear B continue to record offerings and inventories. The palace administrators carry out their duties, but the language has changed, and with it, something essential. The Minoans are still there, still living on their island, still tending their traditions. But they are no longer writing their own story. Strangers are writing it for them in a foreign tongue, pressing Greek words into clay that Minoan hands formed, creating a palimpsest where two civilizations overlap, where you can see both what was and what would replace it if you know how to read the layers. The strangers have arrived, and nothing will ever be quite the same. Look at the Linear A tablets, at Minoan seal stones, at the frescoes from the early palatial period, and you see women everywhere. Priestesses leading processions. Female figures central to religious iconography. Women in positions that suggest authority, dignity, centrality to cultural life. Then look at the Linear B tablets, at the Mycenaean-influenced art from the late period. The women are still there, but they've moved to the margins. Warriors dominate the iconography now. Male figures in armor, carrying weapons, dominating the visual field. The goddess with her snakes gives way to gods with spears. This shift in representation likely reflects a shift in social structure. Mycenaean culture was more rigidly patriarchal than what the Minoans appear to have practiced. Power was concentrated in the Wanex, the king, supported by a military aristocracy. Women in Mycenaean society had roles, certainly, but those roles were more circumscribed, more clearly subordinate to male authority. As Mycenaean influence grew in Crete, as mainland Greeks took administrative control of the palaces, the social structures they brought with them would have reshaped Minoan life. Priestesses might have found their authority questioned, their roles diminished. Women who held property or economic power might have seen those rights eroded under new legal systems imported from the mainland. The archaeological evidence shows this transition in material culture. Earlier Minoan graves show relatively equal distribution of prestige goods between male and female burials. Later graves from the Mycenaean-influenced period show increased differentiation, with male burials more likely to contain weapons and prestige items, female burials more standardized and less individually distinctive. This is the quiet tragedy that often accompanies conquest, not just the replacement of one ruling class with another, but the transformation of social structures, the erosion of freedoms and authorities that existed before, the narrowing of possibilities for people whose gender or class or identity put them on the wrong side of the new order. We cannot know how Minoan women experienced this transition. Did they resist? Did they adapt? Did some benefit from the new order while others suffered under it? The sources are silent on individual experiences. We have only the aggregate data, the shifting ratios of grave goods, the changing iconography, the replacement of goddesses with gods in positions of primacy. But the silence itself is telling. In earlier periods, Minoan art suggests a society where female power was visible, represented, celebrated. The snake goddess was not hidden away, but placed prominently in shrines. Priestesses were depicted in large-scale frescoes, their roles clearly significant. As Mycenaean influence grows, this visibility fades. Female figures become smaller in scale, less central to compositions. The warrior becomes the ideal human figure, and the warrior is invariably male. The values shift from the Minoan emphasis on grace and beauty to the Mycenaean focus on martial prowess and hierarchical power. This is not unique to the Minoan-Mycenaean transition. Throughout history, conquests have often brought with them the erosion of women's status, particularly when the conquering culture is more patriarchal than the conquered. But recognizing the pattern doesn't make it less tragic. The vanishing queens, if queens they were, and we cannot be certain, represent a lost possibility, a different way of organizing society that the Bronze Age Mediterranean experimented with and then abandoned. What might have developed if Minoan culture had continued to evolve on its own terms, without Mycenaean conquest, without the imposition of mainland Greek social structures? We'll never know. The experiment ended. The priestesses lost their prominence. The goddesses were subordinated to gods. And a cultural tradition that had placed female figures at the center of its religious and possibly political life was gradually absorbed into a culture where power was explicitly, unambiguously masculine. In the ruins of Knossos, you can still see her, the snake goddess, arms raised, expression serene, snakes coiling around her wrists. She stands now in a museum, behind glass, a remnant of something that once existed and then was transformed into something else. The queens vanished, but not completely. They left traces in art and architecture, in the graves of women who were buried with honor, in seal stones carved with female figures of authority. They remind us that social structures are not inevitable, that human societies have experimented with many ways of distributing power and authority, and that what seems natural in one era is merely conventional, subject to change when circumstances shift and new cultures arrive with different assumptions about how the world should be ordered. The snakes still coil, the goddess still watches, but the world she presided over has vanished, replaced by something harder, more martial, more familiar to those of us raised on stories of Greek heroes and their conquests. Something was lost in that transition, something irreplaceable, and we cannot recover it. Only acknowledge that it once existed and wonder what might have been different if history had taken another path. His name is lost, so we'll call him something simple. Nikos. He's 14, apprenticed to the palace fresco painters, and his job today is to prepare the plaster, mixing lime and water and crushed marble to exactly the right consistency. Not too thick, not too thin, because the master painter needs the surface perfect for the work ahead. They're repainting the corridor that leads to the western magazines, those long storage rooms filled with pithoi taller than a man. The old fresco has faded, damaged by water seepage, and the master has been commissioned to create something new. Bulls, of course. There are always bulls. Leaping, charging, their horns curved and deadly, their bodies rendered with that peculiar combination of naturalism and stylization that marks Minoan art as distinct from anything the Egyptian traders or Syrian merchants bring to the island. Nikos has been drawing bulls since he could hold a reed brush. He's filled broken pottery shards with sketches, practiced on clay tablets that were later smoothed clean and reused. He knows the musculature of the bull's shoulder, the way its neck curves, the pattern of dappling on its hide. He's watched the sacred bulls in their pen behind the palace, studied them as they moved, tried to capture in his practice drawings the essence of their power. Today, while the master is occupied with the upper section of the fresco, Nikos takes a risk. In the lower corner, where shadow will fall for most of the day, he adds a small bull of his own. Not part of the commissioned design, just a tiny sketch, barely noticeable. But it's his. His line. His vision of the sacred animal rendered in wet plaster that will soon dry and preserve his work for. How long? His whole life, certainly. Maybe his children's lives. Maybe even longer, though that seems impossible to imagine. The earth moves while he's finishing the eye. Just a small tremor, nothing unusual. Crete does this sometimes, reminds everyone that the ground is not as solid as it appears. Dust falls from the ceiling. The master looks up, concerned but not panicked. They've all felt earthquakes before. Keep working, the master says. This needs to be finished before the plaster sets. Nikos returns to his bull. He's pleased with how it is turning out. The curve of the horn is particularly good, and he's managed to suggest motion in the animal's forward lean, as if it's about to charge out of the wall itself. Another tremor, stronger this time. The scaffolding shakes. Someone in another room calls out, not in alarm, but in that cautious tone people use when trying to assess whether this is serious or just Crete being Crete. The master climbs down from the scaffolding. We'll continue tomorrow, he decides. Let what we've done today set properly. Nikos looks at his secret bowl, already drying in the corner of the fresco. Tomorrow it will be permanent, become part of the palace itself, his contribution to something that will outlast him. The thought makes him proud and humble at the same time. He doesn't know, cannot know, that this fresco will never be finished. That tomorrow will not come, or rather, will come so changed that returning to paint bowls on plaster walls will seem absurdly impossible, a luxury from a world that no longer exists. He doesn't know that the tremor is a warning, that beneath the sea, 70 miles north, pressure is building in ways that geology records, but humans cannot predict. That within days or weeks or months, the timeline is uncertain, but the event is not. Thera will explode with a force that will be heard across the Mediterranean, that will generate waves tall enough to remake coastlines, that will mark the beginning of the end for everything he knows. He doesn't know that his small bowl, hidden in the corner of an unfinished fresco, will be buried under collapse and ash will lie hidden for 35 centuries before archaeologists carefully excavate it, photograph it, catalog and wonder about the artist who made it. He knows only that his hand was steady, that the line he drew was true, that he's captured something essential about the way a bull holds itself in that instant before motion becomes action. He cleans his brushes carefully, the way he's been taught. He says goodbye to the master. He walks out of the palace into the afternoon sun, thinking about dinner, about the girl he saw in the market yesterday, about whether he'll ever be good enough to be a master painter himself. The earth trembles again, so subtly that he's not even sure he felt it. He keeps walking. Behind him, in the palace corridor, his bowl stands frozen in wet plaster, head lowered, horn raised, caught between one moment and the next, between being and becoming, between art and artifact. By tomorrow, it will be permanent. And by tomorrow, or the tomorrow after that, or the tomorrow after that, permanence will prove to be an illusion like everything else. But today, right now in this moment, the boy walks home in the sunlight proud of his secret bull, unaware that he's already drawing, in the ruins of the future, already painting a past that hasn't finished becoming past yet. The bull waits in its corner, patient as only art can be patient. It will outlast the boy. It will outlast the palace. It will outlast the entire civilization that gave it form and meaning. But for now, in this golden afternoon, it's simply a good drawing, hidden in shadow, waiting for time to reveal what it really is. A message from a boy to the future, written in pigment and plaster, saying only this: I was here. I saw the bulls. I drew what I saw. Remember me. The diver descends through blue that turns to indigo, that darkens toward black before the lights snap on and reveal that the water has been hiding. 50 feet down, off the coast of Santorini, the ruins emerge from the gloom like memories surfacing from subconscious depths. These are not the famous ruins, not Knossos, not Crete. These are the pieces that didn't make it, the fragments of Minoan civilization that slipped beneath the waves and have rested there, covered in sediment and marine growth, for 35 centuries. Modern underwater archaeology has transformed our understanding of the Minoan maritime world. The Minoans were sailors, traders, people who understood the sea as their natural highway. Their ships, known primarily from depictions in art since wooden vessels, rarely survived the millennia, were sleek built for speed rather than cargo capacity designed to skim across. The Aegean carrying luxury goods and ideas as much as bulk commodities. The underwater excavations have revealed harbors more sophisticated than previously imagined. Quays constructed with careful attention to tidal patterns and seasonal wave action. Warehouses positioned at the water's edge for efficient loading and unloading. Docking facilities that suggest regular traffic of considerable scale. The Minoans didn't just sail occasionally. They built an entire maritime infrastructure to support continuous trade across the Mediterranean. Submerged off Crete's northern coast, archaeologists have mapped ancient harbor works, breakwaters, the foundations of buildings that once stood at sea level but now lie drowned, victims of tectonic subsidence and sea level rise over the millennia. In some locations, the preservation is remarkable. Stone walls still stand, their blocks fitted together with Minoan precision. Ceramic shards litter the seabed, providing dating evidence and proof of the goods that once moved through these ports. The Thera eruption's underwater traces are perhaps most haunting. The tsunamis didn't just strike and recede. They reorganized entire coastlines. Harbors were buried under debris flows. Ships were carried inland and destroyed. Coastal settlements simply vanished, their remains scattered across the seabed or buried under layers of volcanic pumice and ash. Underwater surveys around Santorini itself have identified submerged structures from the Minoan colony that existed before the eruption. Walls and foundations now resting in the flooded caldera. The bowl-shaped depression left when the mountain exploded and collapsed into the emptied magma chamber below. Swimming over these ruins is like flying over a drowned city, a Pompeii of the sea, where daily life was interrupted, not by ashfall, but by the mountain literally disappearing beneath the residents' feet. Some of these underwater sites will never be excavated in detail. The technology is expensive, the work slow and dangerous, the academic funding limited. They'll remain where they are, known to exist but largely unexplored, their secrets preserved by the same water that buried them. But each piece recovered adds to our understanding. A ship's anchor found off Crete's coast, its stone carved with symbols that might be makers' marks or prayers for safe passage. Amphorae from shipwrecks, their contents long since consumed by the sea, but their shapes revealing trade patterns and dating the wreck to specific decades. Lead ingots stamped with marks indicating origin and ownership, proving that trade in raw materials was sophisticated and well organized. The underwater ruins speak of a civilization intimately connected to the sea, comfortable with its dangers, dependent on its resources. The Minoans weren't just island dwellers. They were maritime people in the deepest sense, their culture shaped by tides and currents, their prosperity dependent on winds and navigation, their very identity tied to the ships that carried them beyond their island shores. When the Thera eruption devastated their harbors and destroyed their fleet, it struck at the heart of Minoan identity. A land-based civilization might have recovered from such a disaster by redirecting resources inland, by intensifying agriculture, by adapting their economy away from what had been destroyed. But how does a maritime culture survive the destruction of its relationship with the sea? The answer, written in the archaeological record, both on land and beneath the waves, is it doesn't, not fully. The Minoans rebuilt, but something essential had been broken. The confidence that allowed them to build open palaces, the trust in their ability to maintain trade networks across hostile waters, the certainty that their ships would return. All of this was damaged in ways that never fully healed. The diver ascends slowly, equalizing pressure, carrying photographs and measurements and samples that will be analyzed in laboratories thousands of miles from the site. The ruins remain below, patient, waiting for the next expedition, the next generation of archaeologists with improved technology and new questions. The sea holds memories that the land has long forgotten. And beneath the waves and darkness and pressure and cold, the Minoan maritime world endures not as it was, but as what it has become. Evidence of a people who trusted the sea and were in the end betrayed by it in ways they couldn't possibly have anticipated. The water closes over the site. The ruins settle back into silence. And the Mediterranean, which has swallowed so much history, continues its patient work of preservation and erosion, simultaneously destroying and protecting the remnants of a world that knew these waters as home. There is a moment, standing in the ruins of Knossos, when the guide will point to what looks like an ordinary drainage channel carved into the stone floor. And then Baal explain. This was part of a hydraulic system that used gravity and pressure differentials to move water through the palace. That included settling tanks for purification that featured tapered pipes designed to create turbulent flow to prevent sediment buildup. This was Bronze Age technology. This was 1700 BCE. The Romans, who prided themselves on engineering prowess, wouldn't develop comparable water management systems for over 1,000 years. Yet here, in the Minoan palaces, running water flowed through terracotta pipes. Waste was carried away through sophisticated drains. And in the queen's quarters at Knossos, there stood what appears to be a flush toilet, complete with a reservoir and drainage system. The engineering achievement goes beyond plumbing. The palace at Knossos was a multi-story structure. How many stories exactly remains debated, but evidence suggests at least 3 levels in some sections, possibly 4. Building upward requires understanding load distribution, requires calculating how much weight different materials can bear, requires architectural knowledge that we tend to associate with much later periods. The light wells that puncture the palace are not merely aesthetic choices. They re-sophisticated solutions to a complex problem. How do you illuminate the interior of a large stone building in an era before electric lighting? The Minoan architects created vertical shafts that channeled daylight deep into the structure, using reflection and careful angles to spread illumination where direct sunlight couldn't reach. The effect is remarkable even in the ruins. When the palace was intact and plastered, the interior would have glowed with diffused natural light, even in rooms far from exterior walls. Then there's the seismic engineering. The Minoans built in one of the most earthquake-prone regions of the world, and they knew it. Archaeological evidence shows they developed techniques to help structures survive tremors. Flexible joints between walls, wooden frameworks that could absorb shock, strategic placement of supports that would distribute seismic stress rather than concentrate it. The palaces still fell to earthquakes, but they fell less often and less catastrophically than they would have without these engineering innovations. The question that haunts archaeologists is, where did this knowledge come from? Engineering of this sophistication doesn't appear fully formed. It develops through generations of experimentation, failure, incremental improvement. The Minoans must have had a tradition of engineering knowledge, passed from master to apprentice, refined over centuries. But if they had such a tradition, where did it begin? The earliest Minoan palaces appear around 2000 BCE, already showing sophisticated design. Did the engineering knowledge develop in the preceding centuries, perhaps in structures that haven't survived or haven't been found? Or did the Minoans inherit this knowledge from an even earlier culture, one that had already solved these problems and passed the solutions forward? Some researchers have suggested connections to Anatolia, where similarly advanced structures appear in roughly the same period. Others point to Egypt, which had its own sophisticated engineering traditions. But the Minoan approach is distinctive, not simply borrowing from neighbors, but developing unique solutions suited to Crete as particular geography and geology. The thermal management in the palaces shows particular ingenuity. Stone construction in a Mediterranean climate presents challenges. Buildings that become unbearably hot in summer, uncomfortably cold in winter. The Minoan architects created structures that breathe, that use air circulation and thermal mass to moderate interior temperatures. The multi-story design, with its open central courtyard and strategic placement of windows and light wells, creates convection currents that draw cool air up from lower levels while allowing hot air to escape above. This isn't accidental. This is deliberate climate control, achieved through architectural design rather than mechanical systems. The Minoans engineered buildings that worked with their environment rather than fighting against it, that used physics and airflow to create comfortable interior spaces without the energy expenditure that modern climate control requires. And they did this without leaving us any engineering treatises, any technical manuals, any written explanations of how they calculated loads or designed hydraulic systems. Either such documents never existed, the knowledge was transmitted orally and through apprenticeship, or they were written in linear A on materials that have unsurvived. What we have instead are the structures themselves, standing as testament to knowledge we can observe, but cannot fully replicate without careful study. Modern engineers examining Minoan sites express admiration and occasional bafflement. Some of their solutions shouldn't work according to our understanding, yet clearly they did work, and worked well, for centuries. The forgotten engineers of Crete left no names, no proud inscriptions declaring their genius. They left only the palace itself, the pipes and drains and light wells and structural supports, the evidence of minds that understood materials and forces and human needs with sophistication that was supposed to come much later in history. Perhaps the most haunting question is, what else did they know? If their engineering knowledge was this advanced, what other expertise have we lost? The linear A tablets might contain technical knowledge, mathematical calculations, engineering principles, and we can't read them. The oral traditions that must have transmitted this knowledge from generation to generation died with the culture, leaving us with the results, but not the reasoning, with the artifacts, but not the instructions. The drains still drain when water flows through them during winter rains. The light wells still channel sunlight into the palace ruins, illuminating spaces where ceiling and roof have long since collapsed. The pipes, exposed and fractured, still show the clever tapers and joints that made them functional 3.5 millennia ago. The engineers are forgotten, but their work endures patient as stone, waiting for us to understand not just what they built, but how they knew to build it, what tradition of knowledge they inherited and refined, and ultimately failed to pass forward into a future that forgot them. In the silence of the ruins, their expertise speaks anyway, carved in stone and fired in clay, a language of mathematics and physics that transcends the lost tongue of linear A and communicates directly. We knew things you've had to relearn. We solved problems you're still solving. We were here, and we built this, and it worked. Remember us not by our names, but by our achievements. The palace itself is our signature, our declaration, our proof that we existed and understood the world with sophistication you're only now beginning to appreciate. The drain carries away water. The light well channels sun. And the forgotten engineers rest beneath the earth they built upon. Anonymous, vanished, but not entirely gone, as long as their work remains to testify that they were brilliant. Long before the Minoans painted dolphins on palace walls, before they engineered drainage systems and sailed to Egypt, there were others. Scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic coast to Anatolia, archaeological sites preserve evidence of Neolithic cultures that flourished between 6,500 and 3,500 BCE. Societies about which we know tantalizingly little, but whose art speaks a language that, centuries later, the Minoans seem to have understood. The temples of Malta, massive stone structures predating the pyramids, were built by people who carved elaborate spirals and patterns into rock, who created enormous underground chambers for purposes we can only guess at. The artifacts they left behind include numerous female figurines, some showing exaggerated maternal features, others more abstract but clearly feminine, all suggesting a religious or spiritual system centered on feminine divine power. In southeastern Europe, the Cucutini Tripilia culture built enormous settlements, some housing tens of thousands of people, centuries before such urbanization appeared elsewhere. Their pottery bears spiral patterns and stylized female forms. Their figurines again emphasize the feminine, the maternal, the generative. Across Anatolia, at Katalyuk and other sites, Neolithic peoples created shrines adorned with bull horns and female imagery, with paintings showing erupting volcanoes and figures that might be deities or might be shamans, or might be both. The symbolism is complex, sophisticated, and stubbornly resistant to simple interpretation. What connects these scattered Neolithic cultures is not proven contact, though trade routes did exist across surprising distances, but recurring, symbolic themes, spirals and labyrinths, boule imagery, female figurines suggesting goddess worship, an emphasis on fertility and natural cycles, decoration that suggests the sacred was integrated into daily life rather than separated into dedicated religious structures. Then the Minoans appear in the archaeological record, and suddenly, these ancient Neolithic motifs resurface in a Bronze Age context. The snake goddess with her emphasis on feminine power and animal symbolism, the bull as sacred creature, the spiral patterns that decorate Minoan pottery and appear carved into stone, the labyrinthine palace architecture that seems designed to confuse as much as to organize, the apparent lack of strong military culture, the emphasis on nature and fertility in religious contexts. Could the Minoans have been cultural conservators, maintaining elements of old European religious and symbolic systems that most Bronze Age cultures had abandoned? Some archaeologists have proposed exactly this, that Minoan culture preserved Neolithic goddess worship and its associated symbolism into an era when most Mediterranean societies had shifted toward patriarchal pantheons dominated by sky gods and storm deities. The theory is controversial. Critics point out that symbolic similarities don't prove cultural continuity, that bulls and spirals and female deities appear in many cultures without direct connection, that we risk reading too much into limited evidence. But the patterns are striking. The Minoan religious system, as far as we can reconstruct it, feels fundamentally different from contemporary Bronze Age religions. Egyptian religion was dominated by pharaohs and solar deities. Mesopotamian religions featured male warrior gods and divine kingship. The later Greeks would worship Zeus and his primarily male pantheon. But the Minoans seem to have maintained a religious system where feminine divinity remained central, where natural cycles held more importance than warrior prowess, where the sacred was expressed through beauty and ritual rather than conquest and domination. If the Minoans did preserve elements of Neolithic religion, they transformed it, adapted it to Bronze Age complexity. Their society was not simple village culture. They built palaces, maintained trade networks, developed writing systems. They took whatever they inherited from earlier times and reshaped it into something uniquely their own. But perhaps the inheritance itself, the basic worldview, a symbolic vocabulary, the religious emphasis, came from older traditions, passed down through generations from the Neolithic farmers who first settled Crete, preserved in oral traditions and ritual practices that maintained their essential character even as the society around them evolved. This would explain one of the great Minoan mysteries, their apparent uniqueness among Bronze Age cultures. If most Mediterranean societies had undergone similar transformations, from Neolithic goddess-centered religions to Bronze Age patriarchal structures, but the Minoans alone, or almost alone, maintained continuity with older traditions, they would indeed seem exceptional, different, harder to categorize within the usual patterns of ancient Near Eastern civilization. The theory remains speculative. We cannot prove continuous transmission of religious ideas from Neolithic Europe to Minoan Crete. The gap in time is significant, the evidence circumstantial, but the echoes are there, persistent, suggestive, whispering that the Minoans might have remembered something that others forgot, preserved something that others discarded, maintained a connection to an older way of understanding the sacred that predated bronze weapons and writing and palatial architecture. In the archaeological museums where Minoan artifacts rest beside Neolithic figurines, you can see the patterns recurring across millennia: the spiral, the female form, the bull, the emphasis on natural cycles and fertility, the integration of sacred and daily life, the absence of the warrior as central religious figure. Were these coincidences? Cultural universals that emerge independently? Or were they memories, traditions, sacred knowledge passed from culture to culture, generation to generation, transformed but not abandoned, adapted but not lost? The Great Mother, whether we call her that or by some other name, watches from the deep past, her image repeated across thousands of years and hundreds of miles. And the Minoans, whether they knew it or not, whether they did it consciously or not, seem to have kept her memory alive long after most of the ancient world had turned to other gods, other ways of organizing the sacred, other understandings of how divine power operates in the world. The echoes persist in the ruins, in the symbols, in the art that refuses to celebrate violence and insists on beauty instead. And in those echoes, if we listen carefully, we might hear voices from deeper in time than we usually acknowledge, from cultures whose names we don't know, but whose worldview the Minoans somehow carried forward into an age that no longer fully understood what they were preserving. There is no single moment when the Minoan civilization ended. No date we can point to and say, here, this is when it was over. Instead, there's a slow fade, a gradual diminishment, a century of decline where the civilization continued to exist while simultaneously ceasing to be what it had been. After the Mycenaean takeover, Knossos remained occupied for several more generations. The palace functioned. Administrators kept records in Linear B. People lived and worked and worshipped in ways that were recognizably Minoan, even under Greek administration. But the creative energy that had built the palaces, that had decorated them with such distinctive art, that had maintained maritime trade networks across the entire eastern Mediterranean, that energy was failing. One by one, the palace centers ceased to function as palaces. Phaistos was abandoned. Malea fell silent. Even Knossos, the greatest of them all, eventually reached a point where the final administrator pressed the final tablet into clay, recorded the final inventory, and walked away from a building that would never again serve its intended purpose. The reasons are multiple, overlapping, mutually reinforcing. The Thera eruption had damaged but not destroyed the maritime infrastructure. The tsunamis had been survived. But the cumulative effect of repeated earthquakes, volcanic disruption, climate stress, and finally Mycenaean conquest was too much. The system that had sustained Minoan civilization, the trade networks, the administrative apparatus, the cultural confidence, simply collapsed under accumulated strain. Trade routes that had once terminated in Cretan ports shifted to mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans became the Mediterranean's dominant maritime culture, operating from bases like Pylos and Mycenae. The ships that had carried Minoan goods now carried Mycenaean pottery, Mycenaean weapons, Mycenaean cultural influence. Crete didn't depopulate, villages continued. Farmers still worked the land, herders still tended sheep and goats, fishermen still drew their nets from the sea. But these were no longer Minoans in the cultural sense. They were Cretans, inhabitants of an island that had once been the center of something magnificent, but was now a provincial backwater in the expanding Mycenaean world. The sea, which had brought the Minoans wealth and power, had also brought their downfall. The tsunami from Thera had struck primarily at coastal settlements, at harbors and port facilities, at the infrastructure that made maritime trade possible. It was as if the sea itself had reached up and pulled down what it had once elevated, reclaiming the people who had thought themselves masters of its waters. And beyond the specific disaster of Thera, there was the simple reality that maritime empires are fragile. They depend on maintained relationships across vast distances. They require confidence, sailors willing to risk long voyages, merchants willing to invest in cargoes that won't return for months, rulers willing to bet their prosperity on the winds being favorable and the seas staying calm. Once that confidence erodes, once too many ships fail to return, once the risks start outweighing the rewards, the entire system can unravel with shocking speed. A maritime empire is not like a land-based one. There's no territory to hold, no walls to defend. There are only roots, relationships, the trust that your ships will be welcomed in foreign harbors, and that foreign ships will continue to come to yours. The Minoans lost that trust, or perhaps they simply lost the resources to maintain it. Without the fleet, without the network, without the administrative apparatus that coordinated everything, they were just islanders, isolated, vulnerable, no longer the center of anything important. By 1200 BCE, during the broader Bronze Age collapse that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean, Crete had long since ceased to be a major power. The island experienced the chaos of that period, destructions, abandonments, population movements, but as a victim rather than a major player. The Minoan world had already ended. What collapsed in the wider Bronze Age crisis was just the Mycenaean culture that had replaced them. In the centuries that followed, as the Greek Dark Ages settled over the Aegean, memory of the Minoans faded into myth. Later Greeks knew that ruins existed on Crete, that something had been there before, but the details were lost, transformed into stories of Minos and the Minotaur, of Daedalus and his ingenious inventions, of Icarus who flew too close to the sun. The real history, the palaces and trade networks, the linear A tablets and sophisticated engineering, the art that celebrated beauty rather than conquest, all of this was forgotten, buried under centuries of soil and later occupation, waiting for archaeologists who wouldn't arrive for 3,000 years. The sea continued its work, patient, eternal. It eroded coastlines. It covered ruins. It scattered pottery shards across the seabed. It kept the secrets it had been given, holding them in cold depths where human memory couldn't reach. The Minoans had trusted the sea, built their civilization on maritime trade, decorated their palaces with dolphins and ships and octopi. They had loved the water that surrounded their island, used it as highway and resource and inspiration. And the sea, indifferent to love, to art, to sophisticated engineering and beautiful frescoes, simply did what seas do. It brought wealth and disaster in equal measure, connected and isolated, elevated and drowned, gave and took away, according to physics and geology and weather patterns that care nothing for human ambitions. The sea that took them is still there, still blue, still beautiful, still dangerous in ways that tourism brochures prefer not to mention. It crashes against the same shores where Minoan harbors once bustled with activity. It carries fishing boats and cruise ships over ruins that lie beneath its surface. And sometimes when the light is right and the water is clear, you can look down from a boat and see them. Stone walls that once stood above the waterline foundations of buildings, where people lived and worked and loved and feared remnants of a civilization that thought itself permanent and learned too late that the sea is permanent in ways that humans can never be. The waves continue breaking. The tide continues its eternal rhythms. And beneath the surface, the ruins wait, patient as the sea itself, evidence of a people who built an empire of beauty and lost it to forces they could not control, could barely understand, and certainly could not survive. Dusk settles over Knossos like a held breath. The tour groups have departed. The archaeologists have returned to their accommodations. The guards begin their final rounds, checking that nothing has been disturbed, that the ruins are secure for another night. And in the emptiness, something shifts. Not physically, the stones don't move, the reconstructed columns don't sway, but there's a quality to the light, a sense of presence that daylight dispels, but twilight allows. The palace remembers. Stand here in this half-darkness, and you can almost hear it. Footsteps echoing down corridors that lead nowhere. Voices speaking a language that died 3,000 years ago. The distant sound of water, running through pipes that no longer carry anything but air and memory. The frescoes that remain, protected now behind glass and careful conservation, glow in the fading light. The dolphins seem to move in their painted sea. The priestesses process toward shrines that exist, now only in archaeological imagination. The bulls prepare to charge, frozen mid-breath, their power preserved in pigment, while the creatures they represent are dust and less than dust. What were the Minoans, really? Beyond the archaeology and the theories, beyond the undeciphered tablets and the debates about social structure, who were these people who built palaces without walls and decorated them with such extraordinary beauty? Perhaps they were exactly what their art suggests. A culture that believed civilization could be something other than domination, that power could be expressed through beauty rather than violence, that the ultimate human achievement was not conquest but grace. Or perhaps they were more practical than that, simply a maritime trading culture that used art as cultural currency, that built open palaces because the real defense was their fleet, that painted dolphins because dolphins meant safe sailing and safe sailing meant prosperity. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that haunts these ruins at dusk, they were something we've lost the ability to fully understand. A way of organizing society, of relating to the sacred, of thinking about human purpose that doesn't fit our usual categories of ancient civilization. Something genuinely different, genuinely unique, preserved for a few centuries on an island in the Aegean before being absorbed into the cultures that replaced it. The palace at Knossos stands as testimony to that possibility. Even in ruins, even with portions reconstructed in ways that modern archaeologists debate, even stripped of its frescoes and its roof and its daily life, it still manages to be strange, to resist easy categorization, to suggest that its builders thought differently than we think. Were they the last inheritors of older traditions, preserving Neolithic goddess worship into the Bronze Age? Were they the inspiration for Atlantis, their destruction mythologized by later Greeks into tales of divine punishment? Were they simply victims of geography, building a civilization in one of the most geologically unstable regions of the world, and paying the price when the earth and sea decided to move? All of these might be true. None of them feels complete. The Minoans resist our desire for simple explanations. They remain mysterious even as we excavate their sites, analyze their artifacts, read their records, or at least read the records of the Mycenaeans who succeeded them. As full darkness arrives, the ruins transform again. The reconstructed portions, controversial, sometimes garish in daylight, fade into shadow, leaving only the ancient stones, the genuine remnants, the pieces that the Minoans themselves touched and built and walked upon. And in that darkness, dreams still walk. Not literally, perhaps, but metaphorically, certainly. The dreams of a people who believed they could build paradise on earth, who thought sophistication could be measured in drainage systems and fresco quality rather than military might, who decorated their throne room not with martial imagery, but with a griffin, a mythological creature that never existed, a flight of artistic imagination rendered with the same care as any naturalistic subject. Those dreams failed, ultimately. The paradise couldn't sustain itself against earthquakes and tsunamis and Mycenaean conquest. The sophisticated engineering couldn't prevent eventual collapse. The art, for all its beauty, couldn't protect the people who created it. But the dreams persist anyway, embedded in the stones, visible in the art, present in the peculiar architecture that still confounds and amazes. They persist in the questions the Minoans force us to ask. What is a civilization for? What should we build? What's worth decorating? What values should we encode in our architecture, our art, our daily choices about how to organize ourselves and what to celebrate? The Minoans answered those questions one way. Their answer didn't save them, but it created something that lasted in a different sense, not politically, not culturally, but aesthetically, philosophically, as a reminder that humans have tried different ways of being civilized, that the path we've taken wasn't inevitable, that beauty and grace and openness were once architectural principles, not afterthoughts. The night deepens. The stars emerge, the same stars that Minoan astronomers tracked from these very courtyards. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl calls, hunting in the olive groves that surround the site. The wind moves through the ruins, a breath that touches stones the Minoans shaped, corridors they walked, walls they painted. The palace dreams. And in its dreams, perhaps it's whole again. The roof restored, the frescoes bright, the light wells channeling sunshine into living spaces. Water flowing through pipes, people moving through corridors on their daily business, priestesses preparing ceremonies, artists mixing pigments, engineers calculating loads, scribes passing tablets, children playing in courtyards. Life in all its complexity and beauty, and casual certainty that tomorrow will come and will be much like today. But tomorrow didn't come, or it came changed beyond recognition. The palace fell, the culture faded, the language was lost. Even their name disappeared, replaced by our label drawn from mythology. What remains are stones and questions, art and absence. The physical evidence of sophistication combined with the stubborn mystery of what it all meant, who they really were, what they believed in their deepest selves about why they were here, and what they should build with the time they had. The Minoans built their palace that dreams still walk. They built it to last. And in a way, it has not as functioning structure, but as provocation, as mystery, as reminder that everything we think we know about how civilizations must work, how power must be expressed, how the past must look, might be incomplete. The palace stands in darkness now, patient as it's been for 3 millennia, waiting for the sun to rise again, for more visitors to wonder at its strangeness, for more scholars to debate its meaning, for more dreamers to stand at dusk and feel something shift in the emptiness. Were the Minoans builders of paradise? Or inheritors of something older, still preservers of traditions that stretch back beyond, riding beyond even the first cities into the deep human past, where goddess figurines were carved and spirals were sacred, and the bull represented powers we have forgotten how to name. The ruins don't answer. They simply exist, testimony to something that was built and lost, something beautiful and sophisticated and ultimately fragile, something that reminds us that every civilization believes itself permanent right up until the moment it discovers otherwise. The dreams walk still, in the shadows, in the stones, in the questions that refuse to be answered. And as long as the palace stands, as long as we continue to excavate and study and wonder, those dreams retain a kind of life, a presence that darkness makes more real, not less. The Minoans are gone, but what they built, both physically and in our imaginations, remains. And in that remaining, in that stubborn persistence of stones and art and mystery, they achieve a different kind of permanence. One they might not have anticipated, but which suits them nonetheless. They became the civilization that makes us question what civilization means, the culture that forces us to reconsider our assumptions, the people who built without walls and decorated with dolphins and engineered with genius and ultimately fell, but fell in ways that make us wonder whether our own certainties are any more solid than theirs were. The palace dreams. And we dream with it, trying to understand, never quite succeeding, but unable to stop trying because the mystery is too compelling, and the beauty too real, and the questions too important. Dusk fades to night, the ruins settle into darkness, and somewhere in those shadows, the Minoans walk still, not as ghosts, but as possibilities, as reminders, as dreams that refuse to die even when the dreamers are dust. The light catches on a broken column. For a moment, it glows like half-remembered prayer. Then the moment passes, the darkness deepens, but the dreams remain. They always do. They always will. As long as someone stands here and wonders, as long as the stones endure, as long as we have the capacity to look at ruins and see not just what was lost, but what might have been, what could be, what we've forgotten about the many ways humans have tried to build something beautiful and lasting and true, the palace dreams. And in dreaming, it lives still.